Hello and welcome back to another exciting episode of Pro Tutorials. Today we're going to be talking about conditionals and conditional statements. So for the conditional statements, they come in a couple flavors. You have your if statement, you have the if else, and you have the if else if. And these can be combined into conditional blocks. I'll explain that in a few seconds. But after you have your whole if thing, you have your ternary. And the ternary is basically a way of assigning a value through a conditional. And we'll get into that in a second. And a way of combining if statements, you have your double ampersand and you have your double vertical bar, which I will get into with the if statements. Alright, so let's go ahead and start this thing off. So first I want to make a variable, and I'm going to name this number of apples. And number of apples is going to equal, 10. Okay, first thing I'm going to start off by showing you is the if statement. Now, if you remember from Ambrose's videos, there's a way to get a true or false value. And this is basically what the if statement takes, is basically a conditional, which is a true or false value. And we can do this with basic data types. So what we're going to do is say number of apples. We're going to see if the number of apples equals 10. Right? And system print. If it equals 10, then let's go ahead and print the statement. We have 10 apples. Alright. And we're going to control save and run that. As you can see down here, we have 10 apples. Alright. Let's see if it is greater than or equal to 10. And we run that. We have 10 apples. Let's say 10 or more. Run that. And we get our statement down here. We have 10 or more apples. Cool. Alright, so let's throw an else on here. The way that you do the else is you're going to combine it with your if statement. Now, in between this if and else, there can be a lot of else ifs in the process. But for right now, let's just do our else. So else, we're going to say we have less than 10 apples. Alright? And we're going to make our number, 8. Seems good enough. We're going to save that, and as you would think, okay, if this statement is not true, meaning false, this block won't be executed, and we'll go on to the else. So we're going to run that and see if that's what happens. And as you can see, we have less than 10 apples. Cool. Now something else that you can do with this statement is you can throw in else if in the mix. So we're going to say else if number of apples equals 8. We're going to print out we have 8 apples. Okay. Now something that is important to grasp from this is once we hit a conditional that is true, once we get to the conditional that is true, we're going to skip everything else, as you can see in this. So we're going to run this. We have 8 apples. So it skipped this first block because the number of apples is not greater than 10. We come down here, okay, is the number of apples equal to 8? Yes. So we're going to go for this execution block. And it's going to print off we have 8 apples. Notice that it does not go to the else because we found a condition that was true. Alright. And we're going to prove this even more by making this like 12. And if you guessed it, it's going to go for the first if conditional, and then everything else just doesn't matter to us because we got our first conditional. We're going to run this. We have 10 or more apples. Cool. Alright, let's see how the ampersand and the vertical bars work for us. So ampersand, we're going to say if the number of apples is greater than 10 and the number of apples is, I don't know, let's say less than 8. Doesn't really seem like these two will work, so I'm pretty sure we're going to end up skipping this. We're going to take the else, well, leave the else if in there for now, and let's see what happens. We're going to run this, and as you can see, goes down. Well, the number of apples isn't equal to 8, so we don't have 8 apples, and the number of apples is greater than 10. Well, that's true. But the number of apples being less than 8, well, that's not really true. Last time I checked, 12 is greater than 8, not less than it. So we skip this statement. Therefore, as a conditional whole, this statement will return a false. Because in the first part of the ampersand, we have a true. But since the second statement returns a false, overall, this is going to equal a false. Alright, now let's see what happens when we throw in 2 vertical bars in here. Okay, we have 10 or more apples. Now this statement isn't true, obviously. Well, it is true, but it possibly could not be true. The number of apples is greater than 10, but wait a minute, this statement is false. Wouldn't you think that'd fail? Well, no. The vertical bars is essentially an or. So if my first statement is true or my second statement is true, then I want you to return a true. When we have an and in here, it's saying if the first statement is true and the second statement is true, then execute the following code. Alright? Now we can use this to simplify the code if we wanted to. I don't know if we had like a universal system printout. We could get rid of this else if because now we're taking care of it up here. And take this out. And we're just going to say we have a good amount of apples instead. We have a good amount of apples. And we're going to say if it's greater than 7. Throw an 8 right there, control save. And now the statement is saying if the number of apples is greater than or equal to 7 and the number of apples is equal to 8. We're going to run that. We have a good amount of apples. Now as you can see, the if, else if, and the else statement can be pretty powerful when you're coding. This controls your conditional flow of your program, which is pretty useful when you need to do different conditionals based on a situation. Okay, now that we discussed the ampersands and the double vertical bar, I'd like to show you that you can also have multiple else ifs inside of your conditional block. So we can say something like number of apples, I don't know, if it equals 4, system printout, we have 4 apples, or else if number of apples equals 5. We have 5 apples. And this can continue on and on forever. However many conditionals you want in this one block. And another thing that you can do is you can keep going with the conditional syntax of the and, ampersands, and the ors. So, or true, I don't know. Or number of apples is greater than 0. As you can see, you can get pretty complex with your conditional code. Alright, let's move on to the ternary. Go ahead and comment this out. And the ternary basically has the syntax of value to assign equals a conditional you have to put your question mark, and then you're going to have a true value and then a false value. And the true and the false value have to match the type of the value to assign. Let's go ahead and get into an example. We're going to say int number of apples like before. And we're going to set that equal to, I don't know, 5. Now what we're going to do is say number of apples equals our conditional. We're going to say number of apples if it's greater than, I don't know, 3, question mark. We're going to make our true value 10 and our false value, I don't know, 0. So if the number of apples is greater than 3, then assign 10 to the value of number of apples, to the variable number of apples. If the number of apples is less than 3, then we're going to assign that the number of apples should be 0. I'm going to print this out. Number of apples. And as you guess, we get a 10. Run that. And we got the value 10. Alright, and if we reverse this, or better yet, make the value smaller than 3, then we'll get a 0. Alright. Now that we finished with ternary operator, let's go ahead and move on to the switch statement. Now the switch statement, this is slightly different. The switch statement basically looks for a specific value. It's not really a conditional like the else if, but an else if could easily replace a switch in any situation, which is why most coders will go with an if else if syntax rather than a switch, because a switch is generally bad because of multiple exits, which we'll explain later on. But for right now, let's just get into the syntax of it. So the variable that we're going to switch on is the number of apples. Once again. And I'm going to go ahead and make that variable appear. Number of apples, and that's going to equal, I don't know, 10. Now the way that a switch statement checks for if a value is correct, you start off with the case, a value that you're looking for, so we're going to look for 6 in this first case. And if we get a 6, we're going to say the number of apples is 6. And you make sure that you put a break at the end. I'll explain why you need that in a second. But for right now, let's just keep going. Case, if it's 10, print out the number of apples is 10. Throw another break right there. And case again. Case, it's some random number. I don't know. Print out. There are a lot of apples. And throw the final break there. Break. And finally, we're going to default to the program just gets mad and yells apples if there is none of these numbers found. And default is basically saying I'm not looking for a case anymore. If none of the following are true, then just print me. Alright? And you don't need a break at the default because it's the last condition that you're ever going to get to anyways. So it doesn't really matter. Alright, let's see what happens if we run the switch statement. Now what should happen is, since the number of apples is 10, we're switching on the number of apples. So we're going to go for the case where it is true, where it's 10. So we should get the number of apples is 10. Run this. And sure enough, the number of apples is 10. Alright. Now let's see what happens when we don't get a number that we're checking for. Run that. And we should get apples. Because the program is angry at us now. Alright, now let's get into what happens when we don't have breaks. I'm going to get rid of this first break and the second break. And I'm going to keep this third break in. Okay, so now I'm going to say, I don't know, let's get 6 apples here. If we run this, as you can see, a lot of things got printed. Let's see what happens. So, the first statement that's printed to the console is the number of apples is 6 because, yeah, I just hit the case that we have 6 apples. But if you pay attention, it falls through. And now we have the number of apples is 10. Well, that's not true. But then it continues to fall through. There are a lot of apples. If you do not have a break in your switch statement, once it hits the first conditional, it'll continue to fall through each of the cases, no matter if the value is true or not, until you hit a break statement. So if I take this break out, it should go all the way through to the default. If I run that, sure enough, it goes all the way down and prints everything else. Now, if this value is something that is not the first value, the first case, then it'll go to the first case that is true and then continue to fall through until it hits a break. Alright, that'll be the end of the tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and feel free to email us at brotorials@gmail.com. And thank you for watching.